Okay, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Letterform Lectures, online edition. My name is Grendel. I'm Education Director at Letterform Archive, which is also the home of Type West, which is our School of Type Design. And we will have an international audience today, so please type in where you're coming from in the chat. And remember, if you have questions for our speaker, we will address those at the end. Please drop them in the Q&A. And if there are a lot of questions, upvote the ones you want to see answered. First, I want to give a huge shout out to Skilla Zaccolini, who's doing the behind the scenes work to make this lecture series and so much more happen. Thank you, Skilla. Woo! Okay, welcome to Letterform Lectures 2024. This is our first lecture of the year. We host these informative talks 12 times a year to round out our Type West students' education. And speaking of Type West, join us in person for one evening only, a pop-up exhibition that features the process work and the final original typefaces of our in-person Type West students. There will be beverages, snacks, and killer new typefaces. Register online to join the in-person fun. And for those of you who can't be here in person, or if you just cannot get enough new typefaces, join us online this Friday, February 16th, from noon to 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, as we officially graduate our classes of 2023. You'll see our online and in-person students proudly showing off their shiny new typefaces to the general public. This is also a great way to learn more about our postgraduate certificate program in type design. So don't miss out. Okay. Up next in our Live at the Archive series, we feature data graphics expert and a great storyteller, RJ Andrews, who will walk us through his and the archive's collection of rare and extraordinary charts and maps from around the world. This is a must-see for infographic fans. And next up in our Letterform lecture series, font professional Wenting Zhang, formerly of Adobe and now CEO of Typogram, will show us the latest developments in variable and color fonts and how to apply that technology to your icons. Check it out. We also, sneak peek, have an incredible kinetic type workshop coming up in March that you will not want to miss. So for more information about that and our upcoming Letterform lectures, our salon series, and other workshops and events, go to letarc.org/events. And better yet, become a Letterform Archive member to help keep great lectures like this one today going. Finally, follow us on Instagram to stay on top of these upcoming events and programs. We have two handles, at Letterform Archive, at Type West. All right. Coming to the main event. Our Letterform lectures are co-presented by Letterform Archive and the SFPL Book Arts and Special Collections. Letterform Archive is a nonprofit institution housing over 100,000 works of graphic design history. We are dedicated to the art and the craft of the letterform. You can view all Letterform lectures online soon after they happen. Just check our website, letterformarchive.org. All right. We are thrilled to welcome Simon Smith, the head of engraving at Muse Group. Smith recently designed Leland, a music notation font for the popular music notation software MuseScore. Smith is also a pianist, a composer, and a music editor. And we are really looking forward to Simon's crossover talk, which will hopefully result in more cool fonts for the music industry and a better understanding of typographic needs and requirements of music engravers worldwide. Without further ado, welcome, Simon.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here for what I think is quite a niche subject, but I hope this will be interesting. I'm now going to bravely share my screen. Let's see how this goes. There we are. So let's go. Let's hope this works. I'll start with a bit of who on earth am I? As Grendel just said, I'm a musician. I play the piano.
Simon, I hate to interrupt you, but you still have a little dark panel on the top of your screen that you got.
Do I? How about that?
Perfect.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Linux user. It's one of the prices we pay. Who am I? So I'm a pianist. I'm a composer occasionally. I'm a professional music engraver. We'll talk about what's it doing. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. And I've worked at Muse Group since 2020, which is nearly 4 years now. So I'm the notation guy there, or the engraving guy there. And I work on MuseScore, which is about to be called MuseScore Studio. If I get that wrong, I'll get told off. In the next release, it's going to be called MuseScore Studio, which is free and open source notation software. So you can see here, this is my email address to send hate mail to. I've got a sort of website. I've got an X, formerly known as Twitter account, where I post cat pictures and sometimes some notation things. And I have a YouTube channel where, if you like, you can see me playing some weird and wonderful stuff, including a few of my own little pieces. This is the MuseScore website. Now, I'm not really here to do this talk with my MuseScore hat on, per se, but it's certainly going to get mentioned from time to time because it will be relevant. So this is not like a MuseScore plug. All I'll say just here at the beginning is that if you haven't checked it out, do check it out. And especially if you've not looked at it recently, but you did a few years ago and thought, I don't like the look of this, do have a look again, because you might be quite pleasantly surprised at how we're doing there. So what is music engraving? Well, first of all, it's a completely stupid term that I hate. It's what we use for what we otherwise would call typesetting music, I suppose. Or some people use the word note setting, or I've seen some other more mysterious terms like music processing or music origination. But all it really is, in the simplest sense, it means you take music from a source, which could be a manuscript, it could be an older edition, and then you produce a score ready to reproduce on paper, or increasingly nowadays on a screen. And today, to do that, we almost invariably use music notation software to do that. Finale, Sibelius, MuseScore, Dorico being 4 of the main examples. There are others as well. In olden times, though, the music would actually be engraved, literally engraved on metal plates in a mirror image like this. Hence the term engraving, which we still use. And I think we just call it that to sound fancier than we really are. Obviously, we don't engrave anything anymore. Now, in my opinion, though, the best music publisher from an engraving standpoint, and that's actually what these plates are from them, is the G. Hendy Verlag in Germany, which was formed just after the Second World War. This is their website. And the reason that they are so good is that they actually kept going with metal plate engraving almost until the turn of the 21st century, which was long after all the other publishers had abandoned that and embraced the computer instead, or other alternatives in the interim. But the reason that they did continue plate engraving everything for so long is because they didn't feel that the computer, the quality of the results you could get from the computer came close to the standards that they were used to. And certainly the case that their editions, old and new, are among the most beautiful you'll find anywhere, even though they do indeed use the computer now. There is this video on YouTube, which I'd highly recommend, and there should be a link in the chat or somewhere, which they filmed, I think, just around the turn of the century, which actually discusses and demonstrates how it used to work. It's a really fascinating thing to see, and to imagine that so many thousands of scores were produced this way for such a long time. It's a document kind of a lost art, this genuine plate engraving that used to be the standard. Henley actually nowadays are selling off these metal plates that they have in huge quantities as a kind of very nerdy keepsake. And I've got one hanging on the wall just behind me, actually. It's a nice reminder of where we've come from. One of the things I think it's really extraordinary from our point of view is that these, inverted commas, real engravers needed to understand all of the rules for placement and how to space symbols out in music, and to be able to work it out manually. And I'm going to talk later on about why it's so difficult. Not to mention doing all of that backwards, because even now, when trying to encode the algorithms to do this into a piece of software is a really daunting task. Obviously, the people who used to have to do this on plates had to undergo a very long apprenticeship and a training to do it at the highest level. If I can briefly explain what the difference is between notation and engraving, although they kind of overlap, so it's hard to do it. Notation is kind of like grammar and syntax. So you learn what the symbols mean, and what the correct way is to communicate, to combine those symbols to communicate the meaning that you want. Whereas engraving, you can think of as being like the artistic side. How exactly do you space the items out? How do you arrange them around each other? How do you make good use of space? How do you keep things proportional and balanced? How much do you fit on a page? Things like this. And of course, a big part of that is the actual design of the symbols themselves. So the musical type design, if you like. Let's manage some expectations and talk about what this talk is not going to be. First of all, I will say it's not meant to be just for music experts, or for like a specialist engraver. If you are one of those things, hopefully it's still interesting, but I've tried to keep this as accessible as I can, even if you don't know anything about notation or about music theory. If you can read music, then you'll probably get some bits of this than if you don't, but I think most of what I say should make sense without that, at least I hope so. It's not going to be full history of the development of music notation or even much about other methods of producing printed music, apart from using a computer to do it and engraving and a bit about hand copying. But we've had like music typewriters, we've had dry transfers like Notaset, which is a sort of music notation equivalent of Letraset you might have heard of, which is used for text. That will be a whole talk in itself, just to go into all those things. It's not going to be a deep dive into music font design, sorry. Having said all of that, I will recommend 2 videos on YouTube by Martin Keary, who's my boss at Muse Group. This first one here he did recently. It's a very entertaining exploration of not just the history of notation, but the possible future of notation, because it's looking at all these alternative systems people have come up with to try and replace what we might call standard notation. And although it is a 75-minute epic, it is, if anything, far too short. And Martin and I did make a music font for Muse Score, and although I'm not going to talk about that much today, he's also made a video a few years ago about that process on his channel here. And that goes into much more detail than I could here anyway about how this all works, because he's really the designer person, I'm not. So you might enjoy that. It's quite a fun look at what's involved in that. And that, of course, that font itself is a work in progress still, because there are thousands of characters eventually you need to do and keep changing our minds about how they're going to look anyway. What I am interested in talking about today is about the moment when computer music engraving went mainstream, which I think was really the mid-1990s or so, and what the challenges are, what challenges that presents, and what it's done to what you might call the state of the engraving art. Spoiler is that I think it's mostly not been very good. How did I end up doing this? Well, I'm not going to talk engraving, that is. I'm not going to talk that much about myself, don't worry. But one thing which I do quite often think about is that I think it's amusing that I've ended up working in such a visual field, because I'm certainly not a very visual person artistically. Obviously, I realize you might find this quite hard to believe given the exquisite design of my slides, but I can hardly draw a convincing stick man, and I can't write legibly. And in primary school, my reports were mostly just complaints about how shockingly presented my work was. But for some reason, I became really fascinated at an early age with how music looks on paper. So if I heard something that I loved the sound of, the first thing I wanted to do was to find the score so that I could see what it looked like. And I don't just mean finding out like what the notes were, but I mean, what was the aesthetic experience of looking at it on the page? The design of the symbols, the layout. What was the visual counterpart to a striking sonic effect? And I then became, in the mid-90s, an enthusiastic early adopter of Sibelius, which I think is by now by far the most widely used software used to produce sheet music for publication. these were the days. Here's old Sibelius on the Acorn RISC PC. I had one of those, actually. I got a copy of Sibelius in about 1996, glowing review from the Times there, as you can see. I was still at school in 1996. But I spent a lot of time with this, taking scores that I'd find, and then I would input a page or two of the score in Sibelius, and I would try and get it to match the source as closely as possible. And I was always wondering, why did it not look as good? Or why did it not look right? Or what did right mean? In retrospect, I wonder, maybe I was having a similar experience to these editors at Henley who were deciding the time hadn't yet come to make their plate engravers redundant. iMusic is usually a derogatory term for music that looks great on the page but doesn't actually have much substance or sound very good. Music that's kind of designed to look interesting, but that's all there is to it. But I do actually believe that while, yeah, obviously music primarily is a thing to be played and it's a thing to be listened to, we're kidding ourselves if we pretend that the way it looks doesn't matter at all. And that can mean many things. The most obvious one is that something which looks unprofessional is much less likely to be taken seriously by those you put it in front of. If you imagine in these days of the self-published novel, or any kind of book really, if you see one where the lines are not justified, and maybe the text size is not even consistent, the orphaned lines and words all over, the margins too small, it's full of spelling mistakes. It could be the greatest novel of the century, but you could easily take one look and write it off because of how it's presented. Similarly, I've played a lot of pieces, especially by students, but not only by students, I have to say, which in many cases are very good, but they're hamstrung by having performance material that's shoddily produced, it's badly laid out, it's unclear, it's confusing, it's full of ambiguities. And in this case, it's even worse than with a book, because it's not just that it gives you a bad impression of the piece, because if you're a professional, obviously you have to do your best with it regardless, but you actually have to play from it. And so all these engraving faults and errors make it harder to read, make it more likely that you'll make unnecessary mistakes or waste precious time in rehearsal asking for clarifications. But then the opposite is also true. A truly grim and worthless piece can be given a special aura if it's got material that's exquisitely gorgeous, but that happens a lot less often in my experience. Now, some music is just beautiful to look at, even if you can't read music. On the one hand, this can be just because it's so well laid out, the proportions and the balance is so good, there's no unsightly collisions and so on, the page is just a thing of beauty in itself. The best engraving is like that. On the other hand, it could be because the calligraphy of manuscript, and I'm thinking about particular handwritten or hand-copied scores here, is so striking and beautifully done. And I'm going to look at a few examples of that. I'm going to start with this rather nice example by the Scottish composer Eddie Maguire, who's never used a computer for music as far as I'm aware. Now, admittedly, this is more of a graphical design than it is a piece of music, although I assume the music here is an excerpt from one of his pieces. And I have played several of his pieces, and they all look just as nice as this. Handwritten music is not dead yet, he says yet. So, I mean, he's obviously an advocate for this, and I have to say I heartily approve of that. Now, some of you who are saying this are probably reminded of the American composer George Crumb, who did things like this. And I think this in itself is really interesting because it's obviously the score of the piece in that it tells you the notes to play and what instruments are playing and what to do. It's actually not terribly practical to read from. I mean, reading things in a spiral is not very easy, having to tilt your head sideways to see what's going on. But then it's not intended purely to be a practical document. I mean, it is that, but it's also meant to have a visual and a symbolic impact. And he does this in lots of pieces. This is just one example, which is particularly nice. As well as that, though, I mean, the sheer quality of the calligraphy is beautiful, and the way that he writes everything. This is almost, well, there's a lot of set text here, but this is mostly ink on paper. This is an example also by Crumb, which is, apart from a couple of tiny bits of text which are done with transfers, I think this is entirely ink on paper. And there's nothing unusual about the notation. That is to say, it's fairly standard, if dense, sort of 20th century music. There's nothing kind of weird and wonderful going on here. It's more or less conventional. So there's no reason why you couldn't do this with a computer in theory. But the point is, there's a lot of pleasure for the performer here to be had just from looking at the music, never mind the pleasure of playing it. I think sometimes with pieces like this, and I mean, especially with something like the previous one, it would be nicer if it was actually projected so the audience can see it while it's going on, which actually does occasionally get done. Here's another example. This is also ink on paper. This is a piece by Stockhausen. What's interesting about this, and actually about quite a lot of Stockhausen's later music, is that it's not particularly unusual in terms of what it's asking for in notational terms, but it's got a very distinctive kind of characteristic style. It's very slightly different in every parameter from what you would normally expect to see. I mean, that's because that's what he was like. He was extremely exacting about what things, exactly how everything should look. And so he essentially had a sort of resident copyist for years and years and years who did all this work for him. But again, you have to look at this and ask, well, could a computer do a better job than this? And would you even want to try? And actually, that's been one of my motivations personally and professionally over the years, to see if computer software can, or if it can be made to, produce finer results than a beautifully handwritten score like this. I think it's also the case that the notation can communicate something graphically about how the work actually sounds. Now, that might sound silly because obviously it tells you what the notes are. But this example here is from Ligeti's piece, Atmospheres. It's maybe the one example where I should have given an audio example. But the point about this is you almost don't need to hear it. You can look at it and you know what it's going to sound like, I think. It obviously starts as this very static thing, which then becomes more and more internally active as it goes, like a kind of cloud getting thicker. And it's almost too small to see the details, but that's kind of the point. I mean, actually, this is a tiny vertical slice of the score, which is extremely tall. It only shows the first violin part. So this is a kind of, you can tell from looking at it, this is a kind of sound mass music. And Ligeti used the term micropolyphony for this, meaning a large number of independent but similar simultaneous lines, which he then uses to create these aggregations of sound. But they're made up of very precisely considered details. The music absolutely looks the same way that it sounds. Going back at least a century, I think the way that you lay music out can have a psychological effect, which is not insignificant. For one thing, it can make it seem more or less scary for the performer. If we take Chopin, for instance, one of the giants of 19th century piano music, here's the Fourth Ballade, which is one of his greatest works, one of the greatest works of the piano ever. This is not the first edition or anything, but it's an older edition, 1882. Older editions like this tend to be quite cramped. I mean, paper wasn't cheap after all, and they look a bit dense and scary. The trend nowadays for pretty much everything is, and we're going to talk about this actually quite a lot in different ways, is to give everything a bit more space, make it feel a bit more clear and open. But that does have an effect on the player because it's less overwhelming for the eye and it makes it feel more manageable to play or to learn, even though it's just as hard as it always was. This, for instance, is a new edition of the same piece. Actually, I learned this piece from this edition. I'm not saying that one of them is objectively better than the other, but they certainly feel very different to look at. I'm going to go back to that one. That's a lot to take in. It's the same notes, but I don't know, to me, somehow that just feels a lot less worrying when you look at it. You can sort of take everything one little bit at a time. This can work the other way around. Going slightly at a tangent here. For example, I have here at home a facsimile of the 1611 publication of the King James Bible, which looks like this. Now, it's also huge, this. Reading this is a very different experience from reading a generic printing of the same thing from 400 years later in a new edition, even if the text is exactly the same. Again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. This is certainly much more difficult to read. But I mean, there's a certain effect when you look at it, which is not the same. If you go back to music, you might play a piece like this, which is Beethoven's Opus 109 Sonata. And this is from the Henley edition, 1976. Beautiful plate engraving. They have incidentally done a new edition recently on the computer, which, you know, for those who are interested, is an interesting comparison between that one and this one. So this is one thing. This is where I acquainted myself with the piece, from this edition. If you were very serious about this piece, you might, I think it's a valid thing to do, to choose to play from the first edition, or at least to look at the first edition, published in 1821. Like, this might seem like a fanciful thing to say, but I do think there's a power in doing this, because it's a bit like when actors say when they put the costume on, it feels a lot easier to become this character I think looking at something like this does shift the mindset a bit. Whether you think that's useful or significant is kind of up to you. But I think it's worth a try once in a while. If you were being very, very serious about it, of course, you could look or try and play from Beethoven's manuscript, which looks like this. But I'm not sure I'd recommend it. Now, as far as this goes, there's a value in studying this from a musicological point of view, but this is not really for practical use. And this is quite nice because if ever you needed one, this gives you an example of why an engraver or a copyist is so important. There's a great transformation from this to the first edition, which now suddenly becomes a document you can actually read and play from. And there's a similar transformation from this to the modern edition that looks like this. And maybe this one is the clearest one to read. It resembles what we're used to. But you could also argue that somehow some character has been lost along the way. Why is music engraving difficult? This is obviously a big topic. But I'm going to look at a few aspects of it in some detail. First of all, it's not like dealing with text. Because yes, just as with type, you need to find a font that you like, a set of glyphs, or make your own. But music is much more complicated to lay out than any written language. And I'm going to look at a few reasons why. Here's a fairly generic piece of piano music. I mean, generic in the sense of how it looks. There's nothing unusual about it. Like with most text, music is fully justified. So on each line, which we call a system, the music extends from the left margin to the right. And just like in a paragraph of text, the first line of music might have an indent on the left-hand side. Unlike in most text, you also need to fully justify the last line of music, in most styles anyway. So that means it's not simply a question of filling up each line until there's no space for the next bar and then you start a new one. You need to actually plan out where the breaks will fall so that it stays relatively consistent throughout and the systems are evenly filled. And usually you want to finish at the end of a page too, so you need to apply the same kind of policy on the page level or indeed across the entire thing so that it all ends with kind of evenly filled pages. Now, when you're achieving justification in a line of text, you generally change the size of space character on each line to make it work. That's the simplest thing you can do. You can maybe make tiny adjustments to letter spacing as well. But in music, all notes have a duration. And so the spacing needs to be calculated so that the distance from one note to the next is kept proportional to that duration. To look at an example, if we took a very simple musical example and spaced everything equally regardless of duration, it would look like this. And this looks really quite distressingly unnatural to a musician. Because we expect, in fact, we require, really, that the space is proportional to the durations. Here, all of the note heads are equidistant. But the other information, the stems and the beams, and the dot, and whether the note is hollow or not, these are all telling us rhythmic information. But the numbers there, by the way, indicate the length of each note in beats. As you can see, there's a lot of variation. And all of that information is being directly contradicted by the fact that they're just spaced equally apart. If we were to be very literal about it and space in a completely proportional way, so we allow a note that's twice as long as another note to take twice as much space, we would get this. And this is better, but it's also quite impractical because, and it's not what we normally do, because the variation of the durations, even in fairly simple music, is quite large. I mean, we're going essentially from a quarter to 2, so that's 8 times as long. So it looks quite jarring. You've got all these short notes which are squished together and these long notes which take up far too much space. There are some scores that are spaced out like this. It's called space-time notation, among other things, and it's used for often for a kind of free-ish notation, where you imagine that the eye goes along the system like a kind of playback cursor, scans along it at a constant rate, and then sounds each note as it falls on it. It's exactly the same principle as like the paper roll that goes inside a player piano, which of course just goes at a constant rate, but everything that's being triggered on it is literally proportional to its duration. In normal notation, what we actually do is something between these two things, and we space so that a note which is double the duration of another has 1.5 times the space, which looks like this. It doesn't actually have to be 1.5, it could be 1.4, it could be 1.6 or something like that. I'm quite partial to 1.618 personally. To make the calculations a bit more complicated about this, though, it's not just notes we have to deal with, because there are some things which are used for context or sort of structure in the notation, like these symbols at the beginning. We have a clef and a time signature. We have a bar line in the middle. Now, the distances between those things and which follow those things before a note are fixed generally. So while all the other spaces will stretch and be scaled according to duration, some other things don't scale at all. Now, this is a really simple example, and it's very idealistic because in real life, notes have things attached to them a lot of the time, which mean that you can't space in a completely consistent way. This is one example where I've made these notes into chords and added accidentals to the left, which I do small modifications to the pitch. Now, these take up space of their own. They have no rhythmic consequence, but they have a graphical consequence. Things take more space than they would otherwise. It's actually very obvious when you look in the middle of this, the bar line before the 1.5 beat note here. There's a constant space there of about 1 space. Here, obviously, it has to be increased quite a lot to fit these accidentals in. There's a much clearer example of the problem this can be caused by this when we consider lyrics. Because when you have a text, you basically just put the syllables underneath the notes to which they're sung. But if you have a wide syllable that's sung to a short note, and the word through is a particularly notorious one in English because it's got a lot of letters in it and is rarely the most important word in a sentence. So it's quite often sung to a fairly short note. Well, the fact is, it takes up a certain amount of space, which means that then you might have quite a lot of space before the next note, which is not otherwise required by the rhythm. And as you can see here, yeah, this is obviously a very silly example, but these very short notes here, which are 1/4 of a beat long, actually take more space than these two earlier on, which are 4 times their length. Still a simple example musically, and obviously this gets exponentially harder when you consider that unless you're writing a piece for a solo voice or a solo flute or something, you probably will have several instruments playing at the same time. And possibly you'll have to notate several instrumental lines on the same stave, which could be of any complexity, and these all have to be justified relative to each other. You have to avoid collisions. You have to keep everything as proportional as you can. Here, for example, I more or less chose a little snippet of something at random. The calculations required here to determine what space is needed between what, or what can tuck over what, or what goes under what, are extraordinarily complex. And this is a far cry from working out how to arrange a string of alphabetic characters. Now, an experienced engraver might look at this example and they can pick at some tiny detail and say, well, I wouldn't quite do this thing like this. But the point is that this kind of calculation is exactly the kind of thing that computers are made for. And obviously, human beings being human beings, this has been taken to insane levels of complexity by some composers. Here's an example that was done also by hand, although with extensive use of transfers. And I dread to imagine the time that it took. But you wouldn't have been able to get a computer to do this anyway in the early 80s when this was written. And in fact, even today, it would be very hard work. The great advantage of doing it by hand is that you can make all kinds of practical micro adjustments as you go to get all of the details in. Computers are mostly stupid. I mean, basically, they have algorithms that you can program in. This is going to be spaced a certain way next to this. X can never overlap Y, and so on. But to get a result like this, where you're kind of working with edge cases all the time, and you're bending the rules as often as not, you'd have to spend as much time overriding all those defaults as you would just inputting the actual notes. Programming flexibility and intelligence into software is very hard. Another way in which music is much more complicated than text is that we don't just line things up in a row, even when they belong together. A word like hello might be 5 letters on a common bass line. Each of the letters has their own dimensions and side bearings and advanced widths, and you can tweak the kerning for all the pairs to get everything looking all balanced. But in music, for one thing, pitch is on the vertical axis, so all the notes are at different levels. But if we forget about that, and we consider a single musical note, which is equivalent to a letter, I suppose, then it might look like this. This is like a pure abstract note. It has no real context. It's got no definite duration. It's just a blob. Now, in reality, a note is going to have things attached to it. This is still a single note. It's a perfectly viable thing. You could encounter this in a piece for sure. So here the note is above the stave. The 5 lines that are called the stave or staff. When you have notes which go outside the staff, you have to draw these small lines called ledger lines up or down to the notes so you know exactly what pitch it is. Otherwise, it would just be floating in the middle. You'd have to guess. And then we have an accidental here to the left. This raises or lowers the pitch. We have the stem and the flag and the dots. These are in combination, they specify things exactly about the duration of the note. This one happens to be 0.875 of a 1/4 note beat. We have articulation marks on the top, which specify the articulation. In this case, it's accented, so it's got a front on it. It's got a line, meaning it's held, so it's kind of sustained right to the end with no tail off. We have an instrument-specific marking on top. It's a bowing mark, so that we would assume this is for violin or cello, telling you which direction the bow goes in. We have a dynamic, specifies the volume. In this case, it's very accented. That's not technically part of the note, I suppose, but it belongs with it. I think it's quite a nice symbol as well. So obviously this is just one note, but it's not a single string of characters. All of these are separate glyphs, and they're carefully arranged like this constellation around the note head, following all kinds of different rules. I mean, for example, if I go back, this accidental goes to the left of the note head. It's allowed to overlap the stave lines, but it can't collide with the ledger lines. So if this ledger line wasn't here, the accidental would be slightly further to the right, for example. These dots after the note normally would be kind of vertically centered on the note and coming just after it, but if the note's on a line, they have to go into the space above. Usually, there are exceptions to that. The articulation marks are stacked on top, but they go in a standard order. I mean, they have to be underneath this, for instance. And when it comes to all these distances have to be calculated, so it's not just that you kind of just put them close to each other. You have to specify what the things are, and you have to try and keep these distances consistent across the score, so things don't jump out as being strange. And again, this is just a single note. So when it comes to justifying music, you have to consider the distance between any of these components and then similar components on the notes before or after. In MuseScore, and I would assume most of the software, there's a table of padding values that basically specifies the minimum distance between every possible pair of different types of component that might be relevant when justifying music. That's a single note. What about a single chord? It might look like two chords, but it's not. There's one, well, I suppose notationally it's two chords, but it's a single sounding chord, two durations tied together. There's all kinds of reasons why you might need to divide it up like that. I'm not even going to go into all the details here, because we'd be here all day. I mean, for a start, when we look at how we arrange these accidentals before the chord, that's a whole thing in itself we could talk about for a long time. It's also a work in progress at the moment. There's a lot of calculations going on here to make sure that this just comes out the way it comes out, and the user doesn't have to spend lots of time fiddling on to make sure it looks nice and there's no collisions. So, music engraving is hard, and I could talk about why it's hard all day. In a sense, that's what I do with my time at work. But I should get on to my main point, really. And I'm going to start by saying something which is extremely controversial, which is that Sibelius is possibly or probably the worst thing to happen to music notation in history. Now, if I may immediately furiously backpedal, I'm not having a go at Sibelius itself. It was a tremendous achievement when it came out in 1993. It remains a fine piece of software. There is a reason why it's used all over the world. It's the backbone of the music publishing industry these days. So I say this in the same spirit as you might say that the internet, or possibly the smartphone, or both, is actually the worst thing to ever happen to humanity, which I do actually pretty much believe. The problem with Sibelius, is the change that it caused, or that it was a major part of, or the most obvious representative of. Yes, it did mean that now the ability to produce music engraved to a professional level was theoretically in the hands of everyone, or at least the people that could afford its astronomical cost at the time, which I think was something like £800. But just buying the software doesn't give you the knowledge and expertise required to engrave music well. Just as paying for the Adobe Creative Suite doesn't magically make you a great illustrator or designer either. But design and illustration are subjects that are actually taught and studied seriously, whereas music engraving is not. Music notation barely is. You're just supposed to kind of pick it up. Engraving is not even very well documented. I mean, it's niche enough that the bibliography, so if you can call it a bibliography, is very small. And as the plate engravers of old retire and eventually die out, this knowledge becomes harder to come by. It wouldn't be so bad if the software were intelligent enough to close the gap, if it really had the expertise of a master engraver built into it. And of course, all software claims to do this. And even at the very beginning, in 1993, Sibelius described itself as a music processing expert system. This takes me back, by the way. It's not so much that the software is for experts, but that it is itself an expert. You might also remember this manuscript paper that thinks tagline from earlier, and that's marketing speak, and it's fine, we all do it, but that's all it is. The simple fact is that any software is only as good as its user. And we've rapidly entered a world where every composer or arranger is now expected to be their own engraver. This is a shame for several reasons. Firstly, engraving as a job, even using as a computer, though it's a niche occupation, was at one time a respected one. It required great skill that could be very well paid. And now, for the vast majority of people who try it, it's frankly a grim way of making a living because there's so little work and is generally not well paid at all. Secondly, composers are not trained to be engravers. Some are very good at it. Most are not really. Most people assume that what the computer will do for them automatically is good and correct, which is a deadly mistake. But you can't blame them for that because it shouldn't be their job. A composer's job is to write music. Writing a symphony can take months or a year or longer, but to prepare the score and the parts for a symphony can also take months in its own right. And now a composer has to do both of those things. It takes time away from what should be their primary activity, and usually they are not as good an engraver as a specialist would be. There are exceptions, of course. Engraving the score of a new work is a serious responsibility. The quality of the score has a real impact on the quality of performances, and is also likely to be the score that the piece is stuck with forever, given how much time and effort would be involved in redoing such a thing from scratch. So if the result is bad, the piece might suffer from that permanently. It's very easy to underestimate how much work is involved in getting a piece of music from a manuscript onto the stands of the players. To give one example, around 2005, I got involved in the production of a new opera by the British composer Sir Harrison Birtensall, who died just 2 years ago. The Minotaur, commissioned by the Royal Opera House in London. This was a big deal. So an opera can take years to write, and this one did. And my job was to arrange the piece, which is for a very large orchestra, for piano to produce what we call a vocal score, which is what the singers use to learn their parts from, and for the many weeks of rehearsals that take place with piano accompaniment before the orchestra turns up in the last week or so. This was 18 months of work for me. But before that, the entire score was being arduously worked over by a senior editor at the publisher before being sent out to me, and then also sent out to someone else who was working on engraving the full orchestral score. When the score was finished, the individual instrumental parts, which amount to thousands of pages in total, were produced by several people, and all of this material was being proofed and revised repeatedly as the deadline for supplying it to the Opera House drew closer. In the end, that's essentially 2 years of full-time work for a small team of people just for a single piece of music. Nowadays, a composer of an opera who doesn't have the backing of a major publisher is simply going to have to do all of that work themselves on top of actually writing the thing. In reality, they'll almost certainly try to farm bits of the work out to other people if they can at their own expense. Now, of course, opera is a bit of a special beast because it's the most demanding genre of music in every regard. It's big and scary and expensive. But the fact is, regardless, nowadays a publisher wouldn't even sign a composer unless they were going to be expected to produce their own engraved scores. The engravers who are still working are either attending to the rapidly dwindling number of major composers of the older generations who still write everything by hand, or they're working on new editions of older music, or they're outside the classical sphere entirely, doing like film music, pop music, songbooks, and things like this. To put it very bluntly, the overall quality of printed music has been going down for decades now because of this development, and it is a self-perpetuating problem. I've already said the principles of engraving are not well documented. So really, if you want to learn what good engraving is, you need to look at the huge corpus of well-engraved music that's out there. And I would say, especially from like the Golden Age, which you could extremely approximately say is about 1850 to 1950. Obviously, there are many examples of great engraving either side of that as well. But the more bad engraving, by which I really mean modern computer engraving, a lot of modern computer engraving that's out there, the more that becomes normalized, or worse, it actually becomes a model that people try to follow. At work, I quite frequently encounter requests from people saying, well, how do you do whatever it is in MuseScore? And there are people who are trying to match a badly engraved source. And so my response, at least internally, is, well, why would we even want to? It is worse than this. We have this phrase standard notation, but even in the realms of what we might think of as conventional music, this is frequently pushed to the limits. So in the 20th century, naturally, people have pushed it far beyond what it was originally designed for. I actually think that a lot of 20th century music wouldn't have even been written if the composers had to use a computer. Or at the very least, they would have given up trying and gone back to pen and paper instead, or compromised their vision. I mean, a classic example of this is that almost all music notation software, which includes MuseScore for sure, is designed around the concept of bars or measures. You have a certain number of beats, then you have a bar line, then there's a new bar, repeat till the end. That's how most normal music works. So that's fine until you need to notate something that's not in conventional bars, which happens a lot more than you might think. As soon as you do that, you find yourself working against the software. Whereas with a pencil and paper, there's no real interface. You just write down what you want in the most convenient way that makes sense to you at the time and it's clear. But most people compose music on a computer these days. You'll not be surprised to hear that I don't think this is a very good idea, but I'm a dinosaur and that battle was lost long ago. Anyway, on a computer, instead of getting your ideas down in the most efficient way possible, you're constantly sidetracked, even at a low level, by the question of, how do I get the software to do X? Here is a sketch of a piece by the Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki. Now, Penderecki's style, it's quite low res, sorry about that. Penderecki's style at the time, which is around 1970, is what we now call sonorism, which is a kind of sound mass composition, kind of similar to Ligeti's in a way, but with a much broader brush and sketched in a similar way, in a kind of almost painterly way like this. The story goes, by the way, the reason that he developed this way of notation was because he was sharing a flat at the time with a piano teacher and he found the noise of the lessons so distracting that he went out to a cafe nearby to compose. But in the cafe, there was only this little table to work on. So you couldn't have this huge, tall manuscript paper with 60 staves on it. So you had to develop a way to write this music. This is for a big orchestra with chorus and everything, in the most concise way possible. But I dread to think what he would do today if he, instead of that, took a laptop with him and had to fight with any of the music software that currently exists. I actually saw this in real life very recently because I do a tiny bit of teaching, composition teaching, at my former school, which is a music school. And a student came to me with a piece he was sketching out, and he had a lot of questions about how to notate it. And it was meant to be a sort of free time piece with a lot of flexibility about how the events were spaced out. This would cue this, and this would sort of hang on for a while, and then this would start. But for convenience, he just notated the whole thing in a standard 4 beats per bar. And of course, one of the big advantages of the computer is they can play stuff back for you, and they can at least give you an approximation of how it might sound. That's a very seductive thing. I mean, with my dinosaur hat on, I'd say that stifles the oral imagination, but anyway, it was obvious to me that the computer was preventing him from notating the piece the way that actually conveyed his real intentions about how the piece should work and how it should breathe. So that's a work in progress, and I hope he finds a solution. But I've also seen the real world impact of this, because I know several composers who've written beautiful, complex music, usually by hand in their earlier days. And then once they start using a computer instead, the style changes drastically. Usually it becomes a lot more simple and conventional. Now, maybe they were looking for some kind of simplicity, but it smacks of compromise to me. I'm not going to name any names, obviously, but you could investigate that for yourself. The fundamental problem here is not the composers shouldn't or they can't be engravers, but that the composing process and the engraving process are separate. And there can be a great benefit in performing them separately, even if the same person does both. If you compose music in notation software, you're pretty much forced to deal with them both at the same time. And I think that getting around that problem is probably the biggest challenge that music software faces today. As a final point, here's something else which is important that I think we're in danger of losing. One of the things that's often impressive about an old, well-engraved edition is how much they can fit on the page, while still keeping the balance and the proportions, avoiding the collision and being clear and so on. And this is an entirely typical example. The Mahler's 7th Symphony. It's a big, late Romantic piece for a big orchestra. And this score is designed literally to be a pocket score. In fact, it's probably bigger on your screen, on most of your screens, than it is in real life. Now, these days, fitting a lot on the page like this, clearly and concisely, that's practically a lost art. This is because a computer simply is not intelligent enough, not yet, to make all of the context-specific adjustments required to make this possible. It has a default way, X spaces like against Y like this. If that takes up too much space overall, then so be it. Ultimately, what it means is that most users, rather than spending lots of time to consider that and make those adjustments manually, which includes things like combining like instruments together on a single stave, which you don't see that often now, they simply just make the overall size of everything smaller until nothing collides anymore, everything fits on a page. And that's usually with the intention of printing it on big paper as well. No pocket scores anymore. But that's almost like saying you need a CV or resume to fit on a single page, so you can just make the text all 4-point, it'll fit fine. Or you can use a massive poster-sized sheet. Yes, you might have complied with the letter of the law, but certainly not the spirit. Here's an example of what we commonly see today. I'm not identifying what this is because I'm not having a go at any particular composer or a publisher or a piece of software. This is a much smaller orchestra than Mahler. This is designed to be printed in a much larger size. It's much more spacious. It's been reduced to accommodate the busiest, most active page in the score, and everything else has become tiny, even if it doesn't need to be. I'm going to take a final example from Schoenberg. This is his piece Pierrot Lunaire from 1914. And this, I think, is a spectacularly beautifully engraved score. Although the music is quite dense and it's a bit gnarly and complicated, as Schoenberg tended to be, it's perfectly clear, it's concisely arranged, it's got a kind of certain weight to it. Now, it might seem like I'm going to contradict my earlier point here that I made about the Chopin, or at least what I'm now saying is that the density of this is actually a virtue of sorts rather than an obstacle. But I really think the balance here is perfect. It's concise without being cramped, and it suits the music, whatever that means. But what's interesting about scores like this from the early 20th century, which was like the best ever time for engraving, is that a lot of this music is now at the point where it's just gone out, in the last 20 years maybe, gone out of copyright. And now the publishers are racing to make new editions, often fancy critical editions, in an effort to make sure that people will buy their shiny new edition rather than a reprint of the old one, which anyone could make. The problem with that is that most, or at least a lot of modern editions, are horrible, often for exactly the reasons I've just spent the last while discussing. Or if not horrible, they're certainly not an upgrade on the original. And I'm not picking on this one particularly, because there's nothing wrong with engraving per se, but to use it as a comparison, this is the new critical edition of this same piece. Yes, it's very clear, it's very neat and tidy, but it's also far too spaced out. To me, it looks sterile. It communicates the text of the music very accurately, but it conceals something of its character. It's a supreme challenge to make a new computer set edition of a beautifully engraved old score and to have it be at least as good. It can be done with enough effort. And this is the challenge the engravers out there should set themselves, as should we who work on the software that they use. Now, composers are now expected to magically be expert engravers, but they mostly aren't. And frankly, I don't think it should really be their job. The software does need to pick up the slack. Notation software has always promised that it will do this, but in reality, it's only ever gone some of the way. I do think it's getting better all the time, and certainly that's what we're trying to do with MuseScore as well. Because it's open source software, it's free, which removes one of the barriers. You don't need to put down a load of cash if you want to use it. But as well as that, whatever you use, you shouldn't need to invest loads of time reading notation books either. And if you do that, or if it's the kind of thing you do for fun, which I do, then you shouldn't need to spend ages in the software tweaking everything to get it to look just the way it should. So at the risk of sounding far too grandiose, I see the responsibility now, our responsibility now, is to undo as best we can some of the damage that's been caused over the last few decades by this wholesale switch to self-engraved music produced on a computer. I do have a lot of ideas about that. And I'm sure that those working on all the other notation software out there have plenty as well. As far as MuseScore goes, I'm quite proud of the progress we've made so far in our humble way. So while we're certainly not there yet, I finally like the look of where we're headed. That's actually the end. Thank you. Have a kitten.
Woo! Bravo, Simon. Thank you so much. Oh my God. That was incredible. People, put your questions for Simon in the Q&A. And I love that kitten. Is that your kitten, Simon?
That is, yes. And that's some Henley plate engraving in front of him, so it's topical.
Okay. We have a few questions here, and I'm going to attempt to type in your answers while you answer them live. So they will be recorded as well. So the first question is from Karine. Karine asks, do you know what software is used to design music signs?
Well, yeah, so a music font is like any font. So actually, when Martin and I started doing Leland for MuseScore, we did it in FontForge, which is of course free. And then we started using FontLab, which I think is what most, well, not most, a lot of people use. There's glyphs as well for Mac, I think, isn't it? Which a lot of people use. So actually, it doesn't really matter what you use. Any kind of font designing software will do the trick. There is nowadays, made by Steinberg, who also produced Dorico, a music font encoding, which uses the kind of free use block of Unicode to specify what goes where. And when that came out, I don't know, 10 years ago now, that was incredibly useful development, because finally we could consistently make fonts which could then be used in a standardized way across software. But essentially, it's like making any other kind of font. It's just there are certain slight differences in terms of scaling and the rest, but it's the same principle, the same software.
Okay, type designers. We're looking forward to seeing some music fonts out of you guys now.
I'll just mention that although there are sort of thousands of possible symbols, if you have maybe 200, that covers 99% of what you need, 150 even. So it's not quite as scary an idea as it might seem.
Okay, I mean, that's basically what you're looking at for some typographic fonts out there for sure. So no problem. You guys can handle it. Karine also asks, are there signs used as fonts in music software? Do we need more clarification on that question, Simon?
I may have answered it in the sense that I'm saying it's basically it's just a font like any other. So they're just glyphs that you position. It's just that you don't arrange them like I was saying in strings like you do with text. They're sort of more or less all separately positioned around each other. Yes, the software I used to use before I worked at MuseScore, which was called Score, is very old and kind of predates. Well, it doesn't predate, but I mean, it didn't use fonts in the traditional sense. It actually had little, so what I'll describe it, little vector symbols that you designed in there. It's the same principle. But that was very much, that became very much a silly way of doing it when music fonts came along, which is just obviously in every sense a superior way of doing it.
Okay. Let's see. Barbara Kroll, and I may have mispronounced your name, Barbara, I'm sorry, asks, is this note spacing a rule or rather a preference?
Everything is a preference.
Everything is a preference.
Well, I always get asked this question, what's the right way to do X? And the answer is always, it depends. And people don't like that because they just want to know what's right. There are some things which are almost universal enough to be called rules. But then you'll almost always find at least one perfectly valid example of not following it. So as much as I'm very opinionated, I have opinions about how everything should look. But I mean, when you're making software, for instance, I mean, one of the challenges is having enough options so that people who have different preferences can accommodate the style that they want. And that in itself is not particularly hard. It's just there are so many options to accommodate that from a design and UX and UI point of view, that's very difficult to do without becoming completely incomprehensible. It's something that Dorico did particularly well, actually. If you look at the way that they design their big big menus, dialogues of menus and preferences and so on, that's brilliant. Yeah, but with note spacing, I mean, in MuseScore and I think most software, I talked about these different ratios of like equal and then completely proportional and in between. That's one value that you can toggle. But then if you want to specify, oh, I want this particular distance between, I don't know, a dot and an accidental, you should be able to change that as well. You should be able to change any of those things to whatever suits you. So there's no right answer to any of those questions. It's basically whatever you think looks best. And what I always say is the most important thing is to make sure that you apply whatever you do consistently. Consistency is the most important thing. So you can pick a style you like, but then just be consistent about it.
That hits the nail on the head for type and typography as well. Do consistently. Okay. Can I spell? No. But oh, brother. Okay, well, people figure that out. Okay. Jocelyn asks, is there software for setting shape note music? Or is that a thing of the past? Is that strictly handwritten or can we do it?
I think MuseScore does shape notation. Well, certainly the Smoofle this is the font encoding we talked about before, that includes all of those various shape notes. So in theory, it's possible in any software. How well it supports it is another question. I've never really used it. I've never really tried to use it in MuseScore. I'm pretty sure it's in there, and I'm sure the others can do it as well. So yes, I think is the answer.
I'm vaguely remembering some like maybe it was a Valentine's Day shaped piece. I've seen that before. Valentine's Day is coming up, guys. It's not too late to bust out your MuseScore and make a little heart-shaped composition for your sweetie.
Do it.
Oh, okay. Keep your questions coming, by the way, folks. We have up to 1:30 to harass Simon with your questions, so let's keep them coming. Okay, let me finish this. Okay, Tim Duchens asks, do you see useful applications of AI for helping inexpert users improve their engraving? I'm wondering if it would be possible to train a recommendation model based on images of hand engraved scores without hard coding in any notation rules.
I'm sure it is, and I want to respect this question and take it seriously. But I'm going to say that I want nothing to do with AI for as long as I may live. So yes, other people will work on that.
Okay. So you're going to leave that task to others. Leaving that task to others.
Well, it's coming whether we want it or not. So I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's actually quite a logical, I don't know if that's the word, application of AI when you consider how nuanced this is and how difficult it is to specify any of these things comprehensively, really, and then program it into a bit of software. Maybe it's really the best solution, but I don't want to give up to the AI gods until I have to.
Okay, that's why we love you, Simon. Total Luddite. Okay, not really. Here's a question from Daniel, which you may have answered already, but let's try again. Which music software do you use now for engraving?
I use MuseScore now. I faced a really interesting, not dilemma, anyway, question a couple of years ago when I'd written a piece. I write everything by hand because I'm a dinosaur, like I keep saying. And then I was like, well, I need to engrave this piece. And I thought, oh, what will I use? And I always used to use Score. I thought, well, I guess I'll use that. But I thought, well, surely, and I'd recently been using Dorico a lot. I thought, well, maybe I should use that because it's very powerful. It can do lots of things. I sort of know how it works. But then I thought, well, actually, what I should really do is put my money where my mouth is and use MuseScore, which I work on, to prove that it can actually do all these things that I wanted to do. So in the end, that was what I did. And of course, it's always an instructive thing to do, to find out what its limitations are when you're pushing it to its limits. And so I've continued to do that since. And the nice thing is when I find something it can't do, I have my developer minions I can tell to go away and fix the problem, which they normally do eventually. There's too many things to do. That's the problem. In general, not just my requests, but we have other users as well.
Yeah, that must be handy to have a legion of minions to call upon when you need something.
It's very, very nice. Yeah, wonderful.
Okay. So you write, I'm just gonna follow up. You write out everything by hand, and then you put it in MuseScore when you're ready.
For me, like I was saying, composition and engraving are separate processes.
Okay.
And I don't want any interface between my thoughts and getting it out on the paper. I deal with that problem as a separate thing. That's just me.
All right, keep them coming. We got more lots of questions. Let's see if we can get through them all. Nigel says, not a question so much, but I'd love to hear you talk more about lyrics and the challenges of spacing lyrics and notes together. Also, when will we be able to use open type small caps in MuseScore?
Well, you need to file that as a feature request on GitHub, and we'll get to it. Yeah, I want all these things too. I always like it when people file issues because I'm like, yep, I definitely want that one. And now I have a reason to pursue it rather than just filing it myself. Yes, there were lots of things. I mean, for instance, one thing that we can't do, but it's coming, is automatic sort of smart quotes, curly quotes. I mean, you could input them, but it doesn't automatically do them. So watch out for that one soon. So, you know, things are always coming down the line.
Okay, so but the first one, lyrics and the challenges of spacing lyrics.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I mean, I can't really answer that comprehensively now. It's very hard. What I always did in score, well, I can tell you exactly what I did in score. I lay out the music without the lyrics. Then I add all the lyrics in, but in score it doesn't automatically re-justify for the lyrics. So I just put them in and see where they fall and where they need space. And then I manually edit the ones where there's collisions to kind of move them out of the way. And then I partially move them out of the way as far as I can within reason. And then I re-justify the thing, taking the lyrics into account. Now, fine. That's not how anyone would work these days using modern software. I think the software needs to be able to make those kind of manual adjustments according to preferences that you set and limits that you set. So I really want a system where you can do that. I mean, it's incredibly complicated because if you're setting like hymns or something, you have 4 lines of lyrics at once. They all have their own spacing requirements under the same music. I mean, it gets very, very, very gnarly. You know, and I guess some people say, well, you know, I actually like to adjust the letter spacing, even the letter width. You know, there are all kinds of these little things you can do to a very small degree in order to minimize the problems that are caused. But it's almost, maybe this is an AI problem. It's almost one of those ones where, can a computer really do it, or is it something that you just have to manually go through and waste hours of your life fiddling on with? I have in my time. Yeah, there's a better solution there than we have at the moment, for sure. It's coming too.
All right. Thanks, Simon. I can't even imagine the nightmare of setting hymns. Let's move on. What do you see? Tim Duchenne asks, what do you see as being the biggest forces currently driving subjectively positive and negative evolution of digital music engraving?
Whoa, that's a big question. I don't even know how to start answering that.
Well, follow the money, maybe? Just a thought.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm gonna have to fail on that one, I think. I don't know what to say.
Okay.
It's too big it's 9 o'clock for me at night, you know. It's past my bedtime.
Okay. Simon's gonna have to punt on this one.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh boy, but Tim is not letting up. Tim Duchenne asks, do you think that digital engraving is taking us towards or away from homogeneity? To what extent do you see the MuseScore Studio defaults as defining future tastes?
The computer has definitely made things more homogeneous. There's no doubt about that. It's been said many times by people working on software that most people, not just music notation software, I'm sure actually, most people never fiddle with the defaults. We give them all these options and styles, and they just assume it's fine. I mean, they may not care. They may be like, it's fine, I don't have a problem with that, I don't need to change it. They might not think to, they might not want to spend the time doing it. They may not have an eye for it particularly. As far as the MuseScore defaults go, for instance, I mean, I am able to determine those to an extent. It's based on what I like, but it's not what everyone likes. And I mean, it's a tricky one because I mean, there are, for instance, quite pronounced differences between how, generalizing massively, how things are done in European engraving versus American engraving, for instance. but we just have one set of defaults. We don't kind of have localization in that sense. And that while anyone can specify a style sheet of their own, they can change the things that they don't like to what they do like. A lot of people don't. So there is a big responsibility when you're the person who kind of says, oh, the default's going to be this for this, because millions of scores might be made with that in. It's the same when you have a bug where the layout's wrong, you might have the same problem. Yeah, so I don't know what the solution to that is, because I think it's a general problem, not just with notation, except obviously the more you can make people aware of what options there are and why you would use them, and the more you can encourage people to experiment, the better. The more people understand about what the purpose of these options is. And that's actually something which I do feel quite strongly about, because there is also a trend on the other side. Some people like to sort of fiddle with the options and just make their scores look quirky and distinctive for the sake of looking quirky and distinctive. I mean, fine, they can do what they want, but personally, I really dislike that, if that's the only reason that it's being done. But I mean, you can't win, essentially. I would encourage people, though, to, whatever software they're using, explore those options and what they do, and try and understand what the real effect is that they have. What's hard about it is that in a sort of style dialogue window, communicating what those things are, when some of them are so subtle and it's a very specific context of how one thing interacts with another thing, you can't describe that in words. I mean, the only sensible thing to do, this is what I was saying about Dorico before, they actually visualize all of these things very clearly, so you can see the difference when you choose the different things. I think that's an excellent solution to that problem. Yeah, it's hard because it's very, very complicated. There are hundreds of options. You don't need to touch any of them.
It's sort of what you said earlier is reminding me, the responsibility and the weight that's on whoever is setting those defaults. Reminds me of what happened in printing, the early printers who perhaps even unbeknownst to themselves set spelling rules for centuries to come, just by finally putting these words down in a more permanent and very well distributed way, in a way that they'd never been before.
There's also a point about that in notation. Something like what pitch a note is obviously an important sort of semantic thing in the piece that has meaning. A lot of visual aspects about exactly how something is arranged or the direction that something points in may or may not have an importance. It may just be that the algorithm that's been used, or the engraver who did it that day did it that way, but it doesn't mean anything. But you can't always know that. If you're doing a new edition of something, a lot of people really, really want to match everything about the old edition and say, well, a lot of things you don't need to match that because it's very much an outdated style. You wouldn't do it that way, or it's probably done that way accidentally. In that case, it was just not consistent because they were human beings and we're now using a computer. You don't need to override the automaticness of the computer just to match a quirk. The problem is, though, that you can't always make that distinction about what is genuinely meaningful and what isn't. So that's another layer to that whole problem.
Yeah, that's reminding me of another font example. When people started to initially digitize typefaces for the first time, they often just went to the more recent linotype version of that typeface instead of researching way back to the original version of that typeface. And so they ended up with bringing over some quirks of the linotype, or especially the monotype machines, that weren't necessarily in the original designer's vision. They were just quirks of the machine. So here we have yet another font and music analogy. Okay, moving on. Let's see. John Reed asks, were you able to codify all of the rules regarding stem length, beamed and flagged, with voices on the same staff, etc., cross staff notes and every other situation? We find this alone quite difficult from a programming point of view.
I think beams possibly are the single most complicated thing in notation. Well, I mean, in terms of kind of rules and codifying them, like you're saying. I mean, ties and slurs are very difficult. Beams are hard. We have and are still doing a lot of work with beams, and of all the things that we've worked on, that is the one which I've made the most comprehensive specification for internally, which I still regard as a work in progress. And that's because, I mean, as I'm sure you'll probably know, there is one particular book which documents it quite well, but it's not the only way of doing it. It's not the one truth. And besides that, again, you resort to looking at lots of examples and trying to infer what are the rules, and trying to extend them to kind of situations that weren't even thought about when that book was written. So I wouldn't go so far as to say, yes, of course, I've codified everything. I think we've made a very good start on that. Again, going back to one of the earlier questions, one of the problems with it is there are so many variables there, so many preferences that you might want to, where the user might want to insert and say, well, I like X, but I don't like this. I want this to happen at this. There are lots of options which could be put into that process, which are not yet exposed in MuseScore, to make it really configurable. So one of the next steps is to make it much more configurable than it is. At the moment, they get what they're given, which I think is good, but it's not necessarily what everyone wants. So it's an ongoing process, but I think we made a good start with it.
Okay, let's see. Uli Molly, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, says, do you think the current music engraving community is focusing too much on fonts rather than other fine aspects of engraving? Okay, too much on fonts? What?
I don't think so.
What do you think?
No, well, that's not been my experience. And again, I don't know, maybe in some places they do. I mean, fonts, of course, they're they're super subjective. I mean, some people, I have a friend, extremely intelligent, had a PhD and all that. He insisted about text fonts that they all look the same. There's no difference. I'm like, you can't possibly actually believe that, but that's, some people it just doesn't really register. I think for music fonts as well, it may be very similar. And again, like we were talking about defaults, some people just, that's the default, it's fine. The fonts have a big impact on music, on all the fine details, because one thing about music is that although we have all these glyphs we define, a lot of music notation is actually drawn as kind of primitive lines. So the staves are just lines, the stems are lines, the beams are lines with a certain geometry. And they have to kind of be flexible, they move as the music justifies and so on. So there is a relationship between all those settings and these kind of fine aspects and the font you're using. Some of which, I mean, they're kind of packaged with the font as a kind of metadata file as well, which is very important. Because you need to make sure that the settings are kind of in line with the font that you're using. I think the question of font choice is just one of a whole complex of things. But I've not really personally had the sense that people are sort of obsessing over fonts that much. But maybe I'm not paying attention in the right places.
Yeah, that related to that, I actually just peeking at MuseScore, I haven't seen a whole ton of music font choice available there.
Mhm.
Certainly nothing like you might find for typographic fonts. Is that something that you are anticipating growing, or are there more fonts out there that have not been added to MuseScore, or do we just need more of our type designers to start cranking out music fonts?
All of the above. So the way MuseScore works at the moment, it has certain fonts built in, and they're music fonts, and they're the only ones you can use in the software. And people have often asked to change that because there are certainly more than the 8 or so that are in there around that. So that, I mean, that's something else that's definitely on the cards. I mean, there are kind of reasons why it's a little bit tricky, but there's no fundamental reason why it can't be done. To allow any font that follows the Smoofle encoding, you should be able to use in MuseScore, and you will soon enough. So
awesome. Okay, we got time.
But do make more. People should definitely make more.
Definitely. I put that in the answer. Let's see. We have a bunch more questions. Let's see if we can hit them all before we have to sign off. Sam Messer says, hi, Simon. You've said that you believe that the turn of the 20th century was the high point in music engraving. How much of this is personal preference, and how much do you feel able to point towards universal principles that are being upheld well by this engraving? And what are those principles?
It's also too big to
that question alone, there goes the rest of our time. Okay.
Well, that's a tough one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, the easy answer is to say that everything is subjective, so I just like what I like. I mean, that is true, of course, to an extent. I think partly what it is that the sort of early 20th century, things like the Schoenberg example we looked at, and then music up to like the 40s, that was like a high point of complexity as well. I mean, before we get to the completely crazy stuff like post-war. And so for that reason, I think a lot of the scores are the most impressive in the sense that they manage so much complexity, and also that they do it with at the point where the sort of technical skill was at its highest. It is harder, I suppose, but you could argue this question as well. It's harder to engrave Schoenberg than it is Beethoven. Or is it? Discuss, I mean, actually, some of the most interesting projects I've done when I was working as an engraver were doing very simple music, like children's albums or children's pieces, because instead of just worrying about, how do you do all the complicated stuff that you're used to fighting with, how do you actually go back to first principles and reconsider those basic things? How do I space these simple four notes equally? It makes you focus on those things again. But I think when I talk about the beginning of the 20th century, it's partly about that the music itself was so complex. And also that it was when, the state of the art was kind of operating. And also, I mean, consider at the time, there were these big engraving houses around Europe, these big factories of engravers churning this stuff out. It was a real industry in a big way at that point. And therefore, there was competition. And those who were doing it the best were doing it better than anyone ever else had, I think. But you can also point to some kind of counterexamples. I mean, there were some amazing earlier 19th century examples as well, in different styles in different countries and all of that. So it is subjective in the end, like everything.
So one question that you might be able to answer is how the 19th and 20th centuries both use the intaglio method that is featured in that video for music engraving. Or was lithography incorporated in the early 20th century? Do you know?
I don't know. Yeah, it was, but I'm not an expert on all these different styles or different techniques. There've been all kinds of different ways of doing it over the centuries. I'd mostly focus on plate engraving just because, again, that's where I think it sort of reached its absolute height. And also, I think as a technique, I just love it. I think I don't know. I think it's just amazing that people did that.
It's fairly mind-blowing, but I actually had for a while, so I'm a printer, and somebody gave me a font, like a lead font of music type, and I just didn't even know where to begin with that. So engraving actually seemed like an easier solution than setting this type with this music font, sort of maybe in the same way that engraving a woodblock and printing Chinese characters was easier than trying to manage individual characters in a typeface in the early years. Okay, what do we got from David Eltz, who says, with the increased use of tablets for sheet music? Good question. Do you see a future for dynamically rendered music XML scores, or will the industry and professionals always prefer static printable scores?
Oh, I could say a lot about this one. Well, it's only going one way. I mean, I've said several times today, I'm a dinosaur. I love paper. Even if I don't have paper, I love a fixed layout. I think also because we're visual creatures, I mean, we remember where things are on a page. We don't like it to move around. I don't. But there's no doubt we see it more and more. People are playing from tablets, usually from PDF. It's kind of fixed. I mean, the musical mobile application that renders things dynamically. There are many other kind of applications and platforms out there that do the same thing. Obviously, when you consider that historically engraving has been all about designing something for a page, and I mean, so many of the decisions you make are based on the particular context of that page and the compromises you need to make for the page to work. To have a sort of intelligent dynamic layout system where it can adapt according to all these changing circumstances in any way is an enormous challenge. But that's one that we have to face because it's definitely coming. And that's partly why I say, that the software needs to be able to engrave on the fly. It needs to make those kinds of decisions as you go, because now we've suddenly got a landscape and a portrait or whatever is going on. Well, now the system break is at a completely different place. So yes, I think that's definitely happening. It's just a terrifying thing to face because it's very, very difficult.
Okay. Loris says, what fonts were the most used historically speaking when engraving on plate was the standard?
I don't know.
I don't know if you would have fonts. It would all have to be hand engraved, right? So it would be the handwriting of the person, the engraver, maybe imitating a typeface.
Well,
Right?
for the music symbols, they had these little punches.
Oh, right. Okay. All right.
So a lot of the lines, of course, were engraved, and things like slurs and beams and stems, they were engraved. But for the actual music symbols, which equals the font, I suppose, they I don't know if one could buy one of those off the shelf. I think the publishers made their own, and that's also why publishers look very distinctive. I mean, Henley actually, as much as I love them, they have quite a unusual visual style, which is quite distinct from some others, like wider note heads and quite strange treble clefs and all this kind of stuff. But you can normally tell what the publisher is from the symbols, not just from the way it's engraved. So I don't know if there is a most widely used. There were certain common features between some, but I think they were mostly proprietary to each publisher. I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm not an expert, to be honest, on that, but yeah, it varies from publisher to publisher.
Okay. Alvin Ship. Okay, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer all the questions, guys. So please upvote the one you'd like to see answered if we can fit it in. Alvin Ship says, in university visiting masters, students from China often had incredibly clear avant-garde music that was notated beautifully. Because of language barriers, I was unable to ask them at the time. Are you aware of different music engraving software in Asia, if they exist?
I do not know. I would love to find out if it does exist.
More research is needed.
Maybe they're just very dedicated to spending the time to get it to look good. Some people are.
Okay, Stephen Klaus asks, ooh, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on syllabic beaming in vocal music. If you're making a new edition for publication, would you be inclined to update the beaming?
Yes, I would, is my short answer. That's pretty much all I can say there. I think I don't see the virtues of keeping a hold of that as a style. It's just, especially something like the Schoenberg example, Pierre Lunaire, that has syllabic beaming because the rhythm is very complicated. It's very hard to read. When you get to any level of complexity, it just makes it harder. So I wouldn't. Then again, if you're doing Schubert or something, well, I don't know.
Okay.
I wouldn't personally, but I wouldn't keep it.
Okay. Okay, we might actually finish the questions because you're knocking them out. John Reed asks, being a professional cellist and my partner a bassoonist, we find it difficult to address all of the needs of the different instrumentalist notational needs. Do you have access to all instruments, musicians, or do you just pull out the Rimsky-Korsakov's principles of orchestration?
Well, I do know a lot of musicians. I also flatter myself that I've learned a lot about instruments and notation, and I know I'm prepared to be corrected at any given time what the requirements are. It's something that's quite hard to accommodate in software because the software just has kind of overall rules, not instrument specific ones so much. But that's something you can always do more with. It's tricky though. It's not just about instruments, it's about people. Everyone prefers something different. I think this is why having a sort of dynamic layout is also good. If somebody prefers something notated a bit like X, they should have the ability just to switch it to that. Not in the software, but say, oh, do me a version that looks like this, or that doesn't use this thing, or that does use this thing. That's one of the advantages of having a kind of digital platform where you can do that kind of thing.
Sort of like your Kindle when you can change the typeface.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Simon. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Bravo. And all right, any other questions will have to be directed to Simon himself at a later date. Ciao, everybody. See you soon.